Muito bom dia, sejam bem-vindos ao terceiro dia do Observatório Internacional da Democracia Participativa. Hoje termina então o nosso evento, mas antes disso ainda temos um longo dia de trabalho pela frente e para iniciar precisamente este dia vamos começar com, nos seus próprios termos, centrar a juventude nos processos democráticos participativos. Para moderar esta sessão, Palmquist, Partners for Dignity and Rights. Uma salva de palmas, por favor. Celina Su, da Universidade da Cidade de Nova Iorque. Andrés Falck, Executive Director of Coglobal. Isabel Luciano, Participatory Budgeting Project. Katy Rubin, Legislative Theatre. E Wilkins, People Powered. Deixo-vos então com esta primeira sessão. A quem deseja um bom trabalho e até já.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. This session is called On Their Own Terms, Centering Youth in Participatory Democratic Practices. Buenos dias, bonjour, et bon dia. So we wanted to talk today about participatory democracy involving youth. And the central question animating us is how can we, as adults, and we want to recognize that we are not youth on this stage, right? So how can we, as adults, meaningfully involve youth in participatory democracy in ways that don't tokenize young people's participation, but give them genuine power to shape governance? To briefly introduce myself, my name is Palmquist. I live and work in the United States with an organization called Partners for Dignity and Rights. We work with young people in schools that are working to make sure that kids can stay in school instead of being criminalized and pushed out. We work with farm workers and other laborers, with tenants and people in housing, and with people who are organizing to get healthcare in the United States, which is not guaranteed as a right. And all these struggles over the years have led us to questions of governance and questions about how do people who are directly impacted by injustices, people who are excluded, which is very often poor people, black people, immigrants, and young people, of course, how can we make sure that folks who are at the bottom of these systems, who hold solutions that work for everybody, can be part of building those solutions with government? Just a brief overview today of what we're going to talk about. I'll do a very quick landscape of youth participation. We're going to introduce our panel here. We are all members of People Powered. And then we'll do some quick case studies, hearing about everyone's work. And we know there's been a lot of listening. We've all been listening to presentations all weekend, so we really want to open it up to discussion, hear from you all, ask questions, and we'll talk amongst each other. So for the quick landscape, this is primarily informed by my perspective in the US, but as I understand, I think a lot of the models we're seeing youth participation in are similar across countries. So participatory budgeting often includes youth sections, youth assemblies. It often happens in schools. Participatory action research is a way that young people are often involved in documenting community assets, community needs, community priorities. Community schools is a model that's starting in the US, where there's councils of teachers, parents, administrators, and students working together to set school policy. We have restorative justice in schools, where in the US, in a system with a lot of criminalization, especially of black and brown students, students are working with teachers and principals to address behavioral problems in the schools in group circles. There's youth councils and advisory committees are common, I know, in a lot of countries where youth get to advise government on different policies. And legislative theater, which we'll be hearing about from Katy today. So I want to quickly turn it over to our wonderful panelists here to just quickly introduce themselves. So your name, where you are, where you're working, and if there's one animating question you want to share with the audience. I think everybody should have a microphone, and we'll start with Zoe and go down the line.
Hello. It's on. Hi, everyone. I'm Zoe Wilkins. I work at People Powered. As Ben mentioned, we are all members of People Powered, and together we try to build capacity for participatory democracy. So for me, the question I'm trying to think about today is really, how can we learn from each other, be honest with each other, think about the strategies we have, but also share the frustrations, what doesn't work, and put our brains together to think about how we can solve some of those things.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Isabel Luciano. I work for the Participatory Budgeting Project. We help implement participatory budgeting across the US and Canada. And one of the questions that I'll be exploring today is, how can we add somewhat of a socioeconomic lens? And how can youth employment have a place in participatory budgeting specifically, but also participatory democracy more broadly to engage young people in our democracy?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this rainy morning. Happy to be here. My name is Katy Rubin. I'm a legislative theater practitioner and creative civic strategist working in the UK and internationally. And my question is, what's the responsibility of us grown-ups to be honest with young people about what really can change in a participatory process and how much leadership we really are able to give over and how much we're not? Those are the questions I'm asking.
Hi, so my name is Andrés. I'm from an organization in Spain called Coglobal, which is a member of People Powered. So my question is about how do we build up to youth participation before? So my work is on children, or maybe older children or younger youth, somewhere between 10 and 14, and I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on how we start working with them, especially in educational contexts, to foster youth participation.
Hi, my name is Celina Su. I'm from the Public University in New York City. It's great to be here with you. Thank you for being here. I started working with New York's participatory budgeting process when it started in 2011, and maybe my animating question today is one that I have heard from a lot of participants in that process, especially youth ones, of they're getting to participate, but they are also questioning participation for what? What's the larger project it's for? Are they getting to start to share some power, or work towards a city they can really thrive in?
Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. All right, so we're going to jump in now and hear more from everybody about their work in a little more detail. And again, we'll have time to have conversation with you all after, so please start thinking of your own questions as well. Zoe.
Thanks, Ben. So as I mentioned, I'm Zoe, and I work at People Powered. Between 2022 and 2024, we were running a program called the Building Inclusive Democracy Project. And this was over 20 organizations contributing, piloting, thinking together about what inclusive democracy looks like and how we can build capacity also in different regions. How can we think about making participatory and deliberative decision-making more inclusive of marginalized groups? And we specifically focus on how can we think about the inclusion of women, youth, and displaced people. So here's a sample of all of the organizations that were contributing, piloting these programs, monitoring, evaluating, feeding back up what was working and what wasn't. So the goals of this program were to exchange and collect the best practices and resources on inclusion, and particularly in different participatory and deliberative processes in diverse regions and in different languages, and trying to pinpoint what works where, what can we share, and what is more specific and place-based. And then from that, we tried to think about how we strengthen capacities and increase knowledge of local and regional organizations to make participatory and deliberative processes more inclusive, and really thinking about across these 3 regions how we can build connections like we're all doing here today. And so not just having the depth, but also that breadth and kind of moving between the 2. The 3 phases of this program were to exchange. So there was first sort of 6 months were all about sharing ideas, thinking about what we've tried before, what's working, then bringing these things together and piloting them with the different organizations who are part of the program, and then also communicating, thinking as they were implementing. Often we think about the design and we get that far, but then implementation, people get too busy, their heads are down, and so we really tried to make sure that we were communicating as we tried the different techniques that had been identified. So one big outcome that we pulled together are these strategy documents. So I pulled in part of what you can see on the right, and we'll zoom in on that for you in a moment. But through everybody, we came up with different strategies for each of the groups. And so today I'm talking about the youth piece around how we can think about advocacy, planning and design, recruitment and outreach, inclusive facilitation, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. So highlighting here that we also can't just be inclusive in one part, but that this actually really needs to run through every different aspect of a program, from the very early ideation stages to thinking about, well, what worked and what didn't. So when we think about investing in young people, to give you a sample of the advocacy, we talked a lot about how do we provide opportunities for youth to think about the education and training that they need so that they feel confident to participate in these spaces. How can we think about establishing young representatives so that they're built into these processes? As I think Isabel will talk a bit about more, how can we also think about the socioeconomic elements, financing civic education, making sure youth are empowered not in one dimension to participate, but across many? And how can we also think about facilitating these programs in ways, like Katy will tell us a bit about, that are less me talking to you, but that are really open spaces that people from all kinds of backgrounds feel they can participate in, and that feels more open for young people. Also thinking about how we build partnerships to encourage youth participation so that it's not always us going directly to young people, but thinking about what are their existing networks, how can we access them, how can we support them, and how can we build that up together. So to give you an example of one of the many programs that were implemented as part of this, we had in Novi Sad in Serbia a participatory budgeting project. And there, these strategies, they fed back up to the wider group, were around supporting networks of student bodies to build capacity to engage in the public sphere. So these networks already existed. Like I said, how can we access them and tap into them? How can we support informal youth groups and think about those networks? Integrating young people in every stage of the design, and also building long-term partnerships. So not just a one-off, but something that's more embedded. But on the topic of participatory budgeting, I think I'm now going to pass you to Isabel.
Thanks, Katy. So I've been experimenting with participatory budgeting youth fellowships, where it's half a youth program and half a job for young people. And they have a dedicated role to support their participatory budgeting process in their own city. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I see as the impacts and the role that this can have in engaging young people in our democracy in a meaningful way. And also a few examples of why I think, this can both improve our communities, but also be a tangible pathway for young people to get involved. So before I dive into the programs themselves, why youth and participatory budgeting? Well, participatory budgeting aims to engage those most typically left out of our decision-making spaces. So we pay a lot of attention to do a little bit more intentional and focused outreach to really get those that are not usually at the table. So participatory budgeting, as many of you all know, is already kind of designed to do this. Youth in particular are not allowed to vote and are impacted by the decisions that we make on their behalf. And that can be from education, reproductive rights, even government power and decision making. And so we see PB in general as a really tangible way for them to make decisions over their everyday environments, especially since there's already care. We go into the communities to ask, how old do you have to be to participate? And we always encourage communities to go really young. So there's already kind of a pre-design where PB is helpful to bring young people into that space. Young people's unique use of spaces and services also bring really good insights into our neighborhoods that are not often captured by traditional decision-making processes. And so, like for example, young people may not have somewhere to hang out at night, and so they may use their spaces a little differently and bring a lot of insight. And the last point I wanted to touch on, why PB as the tool, is that PB allows young people to assume different roles within the participatory budgeting process, and so they acquire a lot of transferable skills, and which presents a pathway to long-term civic engagement. And you need to go into the communities to facilitate community discussions and ask people what they need, so that's facilitation. You need to engage the community, so that's community engagement. And there's a lot of project management involved on top of the decision making, so we think those skills are really transferable into anything that they want to try out later in life. I'm going the wrong way too. Apologies. So why might they choose PB Youth Fellowships? Well, as a paid job, the program offers youth to take a meaningful, dedicated role in their participatory budgeting process. So, for example, in the programs that we've run in the past few years, their role has been to engage their communities in participatory budgeting. So they have one role, no one questions it, and it's their job. As a fellowship, the program nurtures their professional development, and that allows them to gain and explore skills that they can use in many fields. And so, that can look like, because the program is also over the course of, let's say, 10 months, or the participatory budgeting process of the whole length of it, they really get to explore what skills they want to try out. If they have a particular theory of change, they get to explore it in a safe space to do so. So they really have the time, and we really cultivate the exploration. And as opposed to a typical job, they have the opportunity to focus, their creative and critical thinking skills in service of their community. And also really important, that's without sacrificing their financial needs, which becomes really important for inclusion, right? To include young people that, they may not have the ability to do a lot of extracurricular activities, or may have to, choose getting a part-time job to either support their families. A lot of them are caretakers. So this applies to young people as well. And so when we talk about including young people in our democracy, it can be really helpful and supportive to them to engage them through a job. And I think also the thing to touch on is that as a fellowship in a youth program, it works around their schedules. So a lot of first jobs that young people get, they might have to put in too many hours. It's not compatible with school. And so these programs are really designed for young people's schedules and designed with them. So just want to touch on a few examples of how young people being involved in this capacity, having this dedicated role, can enrich our decision-making in our local communities. So in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I was working with a group of high school students, and they were tasked with supporting their participatory budgeting process in city council in New York City at the time. You had several city councils, districts participating in PB, so they would each lead their own PB process. And during the pandemic, they put it on pause. And so the young people we were working with really wanted to continue in service of their community. And so they successfully led the New York Civic Engagement Commission's first participatory budgeting process. So New York City residents, there was a ballot initiative, and they decided that participatory budgeting needed to happen across the entire city, not just in participating city council districts. And so the young people we were working with really led a youth program, a youth participatory budgeting program that they designed, and it was for youth. It was small. It was only $100,000 that they were deciding how to allocate. And for New York City, that's not a lot of money, but they successfully found a way to engage people when we couldn't meet in person. So they leveraged technology. They put out a question that people could answer using this platform called Polis, and young people could participate if they didn't have a lot of time, but also they had the opportunity to attend a facilitated discussion on Zoom. And the young people we were working with leveraged youth organizations. So there was already youth programming taking place across the city, and they called up those organizations and facilitated discussions with the young people in those programs. And so this really became a blueprint that the New York Civic Engagement Commission still uses for their now citywide program, much bigger program than this pilot was. But the way that they partner with organizations, they were able to pilot with the youth in the program that first year. The second year, we worked with more youth with the New York Civic Engagement Commission, and they activated the PB events where we were trying to get the community out to suggest ideas and vote. And so they brought a lot of joy to the process. You can see some pictures here. They really made participatory budgeting, getting engaged, a little bit more joyful and fun, so it's not just a community meeting. They also leveraged their PB experience to go beyond participatory budgeting. So the New York Civic Engagement Commission was really trying to find out why young people are not getting involved in their community boards. And community boards advise on the needs of their own district across the city. And they had lowered the age so you could be 16 to participate, but for some reason young people were not participating. And so you can see here a flyer of the young people in our program. They really became interested. So they kind of started to develop an expertise in how to get community members to engage. And they interviewed the handful of community board members that are 16 that are there, and they provided a lot of insight into why young people are not joining their community boards. They decided to lead an info session where they actually helped young people to apply. It was a very confusing process. And so, they provided a lot of insight about what we can do to get more young people to engage more broadly beyond participatory budgeting. So they really brought a fresh perspective to accessibility. Another example is that we had a civic engagement platform. A lot of y'all are using it, Decidem. And so people were suggesting ideas there. And so they did some user testing design, watched people interact with the website, and provided some recommendations to the New York Civic Engagement Commission about how to make it more accessible. And the last example I wanted to touch on was in Seattle. So there, it was really exciting for us because we not only paid young people in the program to engage young people across Seattle to participate in their participatory budgeting process, but we also gave them a budget to support whatever intervention they wanted to design. And so they decided to support 3 local organizations that were already working with young people to broaden their reach, because they recognized that we only had 15 of them. That's not a lot of people to engage a whole city. And so they chose 3 organizations that they thought were doing really impactful work with youth and that could get the youth out to really impact and broaden their reach with the resources that we had. And so I think for me, one of the most interesting things here is that, as someone that has been doing participatory budgeting for a long time, they were really creative in the organizations that they selected. So they brought arts to participatory budgeting in a way that was really meaningful. So they partnered with youth arts organization, and that led to really creative participatory budgeting events that, again, challenged the way that engaging with our democracy can look like. For example, they designed a youth open mic night, so young people that were artists, whether they were poets, singers, rappers, they could come into the stage and perform, and then that would end in idea collection or voting. They also had a free dinner for young people. So again, recognizing that young people may not have the means to go to dinner and have fun with their friends. So they used their budget to have a shared meal together and then learn about participatory budgeting and suggest their ideas. Again, we did that for the voting. And they also did a family skate night. So again, skating events, really attuning to the young people's interests. And so when we think about how our democracy can look like, young people can really meaningfully change and challenge what the experience of participating in our democracy. All that to say, it's not perfect. There are a lot of challenges, but providing dedicated youth programming and paying young people for their time can really help equalize and bring them in.
I love that.
Turn it to Katy now.
Awesome. Thanks, Isabel. I love the emphasis on joy and creativity in there. That's so cool. And okay, so since I'm yes, here we go. Great. Since I'm in the middle here, yeah. All right. Since I'm in the middle here and it's Saturday morning and we're talking about participation, I would like us to just do a very quick bit of participation. I apologize, everybody. But if you can put down your pens for a second and raise one hand. There you go. Great. Okay. Beautiful. Excellent. And make a big circle in the air with your hand. Great. We're just trying to wake us up so we can stay here, stay present, think about participation. Keep that circle going. I'm going to switch hands with my mic, but don't stop the circle, okay? Good. Keep the circle going. Great. Now lift up your other hand. You got the circle going. Good, good, good. Make a plus sign, a little cross with the other hand. There you go. Circle with one hand, plus sign with the other hand. You're doing great. You're doing great. Now keep the plus sign going, please. And write your name in the air with the first hand. Let's go, let's go. Have a go, have a go. Yes, there you go. Write your name. Yes, give yourselves a round of applause. Amazing. Where did I skipped ahead. Amazing, all right. So, I was flying through my slides while we were doing that. Whoops. Great, okay, so, what happened? Oh no, sorry. All right, so, I got discombobulated too. Okay, so when we start a legislative theater process, it is, that's what's happening. I don't know which way I'm going now. What's happening? Can somebody help us technically? It's like moving itself. Okay, I'm just gonna talk to you. All right, did it stop? Okay, great. So, technology, that's not my tool. All right, so some of you were in a workshop yesterday on legislative theater. I'll tell you really quickly what legislative theater is. But the reason why we started with a game, right, is that we start every legislative theater process, even a process with a lot of grown-ups, a lot of policymakers in a room, with everybody getting taking a little bit of a risk, having a little bit of fun, getting a little bit uncomfortable so that we can think about switching around the power dynamics. Right? That's really important, and I think that's really important in processes with young people about analyzing and then overturning the power dynamics. And what I want to talk to you about today is actually where those kind of power dynamics come in conflict with a youth-led process. So really briefly, what is legislative theater? Because you might not know. Comes out of Brazil, out of the tradition of theater of the oppressed. Communities like us gather, tell stories, identify problems, and create a play based on their experience. I'm going to be talking about this project in particular around barriers to access to youth mental health services in Greater Manchester. So this is an example of a scene, right? And you see young people acting out a story. I'll come back to that. Then we've got lots of different issues. You see other young people here with Glasgow City Council working on the climate and transport plans and how they're accessible. We create these plays. We bring together policymakers, peers, advocates, neighbors, activists, all those folks to analyze the problems in the play, right? And then actually come on stage because we've all been warmed up and test out new ideas and see how they might work. So again, this is part of that youth mental health project that we're going to analyze a little bit together in the next few minutes. So through that testing process, right, through actually coming up live testing ideas, we're ready to draft policy proposals to address the problems all together in a shared creative space, right? Put those together, analyze them with the help of policymakers and activists and advocates, yeah, who all right there in the same room in that sort of power overturned space can work together with the young people, with the audience, whoever those actors, those creators, right? Again, when I say actors, I mean people who are impacted by a policy problem and who want to take action, right? Can then deliberate and debate further and amend and have a vote and get commitments to action from those policymakers, which we then follow up on, push forward, and make sure that those things happen. That's the process, yeah? Is that okay? All right. So, I swear I'm going backwards. I'm trying to go backwards. Oh my gosh. Go the other way to go backwards? No? Whatever. I'm gonna, please. This is getting away from me. It's fine, you can leave it there, I don't care. Here we also have the Youth Mental Health Project. All right, so this process is really valuable, right? As we've sort of hinted to before, particularly when we're trying to create an environment for inclusivity, right? An environment that doesn't necessarily look like those kind of formal or intimidating or language-heavy democratic processes that we might be used to, particularly in the global north, but right, anywhere that we're replicating these kind of talky, jargony, sitting down environments. So what are other environments that we can do democratic participation? As we've heard already, we can use arts, we can use creativity, we can use our bodies, we can use our own knowledge, particularly in an area like youth mental health, which is absolutely an epidemic in the UK, yeah, where there are also topics that are really difficult to talk about. So in a project with Greater Manchester, NHS, the National Health Service of the UK, and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is the regional government, and some local youth mental health and youth democracy charities, 42nd Street and Youth Focus Northwest, we came together 2 years ago for a project and invited young people to create a play about their challenges getting access to good mental health services in schools, in hospitals, right? All of the above. And you saw some scenes from the play. There was a scene about police and exacerbating youth mental health crises. There were scenes about school counselors' offices where young people are not allowed to talk to each other in the waiting room, and it's absolutely kind of very, very criminalized even to be there, so it's not welcoming. People can't get peer support. These are all kinds of barriers that were policy questions for the young people. And out of that process, there were some real clear policy commitments and outcomes, right? So we had policymakers like people who hold budgets in schools for mental health and counseling. One of the outcomes was that a budget to design a new counseling center in a school district in Oldham, which is part of Greater Manchester, one of the local authorities, committed to giving that budget to the young people to design the counseling space so that they could make it colorful, add books, add couches, add snacks, right? What are things that will make a youth mental health space feel welcoming and supportive? Those were some real concrete outcomes. We also got commitments from the NHS to involve young people in developing training for mental health practitioners and delivering that training. So these were really exciting outcomes. And out of those outcomes, there was a second phase of this project. I'm going to get into the problems now. Is everybody following me? Talking fast. Okay. And I've given up on the slides, so we're here. We see there's voting, there's action. All right. So out of that project, there was a lot of excitement, and we got a second round of funding to grow it. And the organizers said, this project now, we see that there's a lot of energy around youth mental health, participatory democracy. This is going to be youth-led. We kept emphasizing this term, youth-led. What does it mean for the young people to have control of lots and lots of elements of this project? And so there were lots of pieces involved, but one piece that you might have seen before in the slide, something that's really important in the legislative theater ethics, is that young people or anyone who is a participant can also be a facilitator. Right? That we're passing on the power to replicate and multiply, we say, this process. If everyone can be an actor and everyone can be a policymaker, which I deeply believe, everyone can also be an organizer or a facilitator, even and including and especially young people. Right? And what happens when young people talk to other young people? Right? What is the extra power in that it's not adults leading a process? So part of this new project called Mindset Revolution was that young people were going to be trained, 4 young people from the original play who wanted to become facilitators, paid, everybody gets paid in both rounds of this project because it's a job, but also that could become a future job for them. So there were 8 weeks of training in how to lead games, exercises, dialogue, how to tell stories, how to gather stories, how to work with young people, how to do safeguarding, all this kind of stuff. For 4 young people, it was really incredible, a lot of mutual support. They had homework, they practiced, they knew which exercises they were going to lead. They practiced ways to give each other feedback, right? That was really key. And then, in this project, they led a whole new legislative theater project on youth mental health with a new group of young people. That was incredibly, I think that was incredibly successful. Some of the young people you've seen in these slides are now getting hired to do other legislative theater projects, even in other cities, right? Getting really excellent day rates, right? Consultant rates, turning this into their job, but also making these projects, I feel, so much more impactful because they are being facilitated by young people. 4 new facilitators out of this project. So that was excellent. But on the other hand, this idea of youth leadership also meant that there was a promise of a lot of policy change. We're going to be able to change everything and you're going to lead it. What this meant is that some of the adults let go of some of the responsibility of figuring out who those policymakers need to be, how to get them there, how to build those relationships with the young people before the event, and how to make sure that they felt really, really committed and accountable to the process. There were kind of 2 tiers of young people in this process. There were the facilitators, I think they got a ton out of this, and then there were the new actors who were, again, promised policy change. But I think in this project we were over-promising. Can we promise leadership development, capacity building, facilitation training, and policy change led by youth? We had the public legislative theater event. These policymakers came. They didn't take very seriously the leadership of the young people. It was excellent facilitation, fantastic play, but they didn't take very seriously the leadership of the young people. And we were thinking as adults afterwards, what's the responsibility of the adults to kind of hold that space and make sure that we're not then telling our stories, putting ourselves out there, putting this energy out there, especially in something like youth mental health, but really anything that we talk about in participatory democracy are things that impact our lives, right, and relate to equity and justice. And there was a lot of disappointment and deflation at the end of that event that those policymakers just took it as an exercise to either self-promote or condescend. And I thought, all of us thought, and there's been a lot of reflection on this process, that's why we wanted to be really honest with you, right? What does it mean to go from kind of 0 to 60 in terms of promising youth leadership? What are the things we can promise? And particularly, what are the kinds of concrete policy outcomes that can come from a process? And how much accountability and pushing does that take? And what kind of support does it take for young people to be able to push policymakers to that end, right? To really say, are you going to be accountable to me? So just to clarify, right, what I think was successful, young people listened to other young people. So the facilitation, very successful. Policymakers did not. And the adults organizing this process, right, didn't really foresee how harmful that could be for young people telling their stories. And had to do a lot of repair afterwards to figure out what are the outcomes, what can we feel proud of, and how do we feel like we can really make those changes. And so my question is, and we'll talk more about this, my question is, yeah, what is the responsibility of those adults? And how do we be really clear in any participatory process, but particularly with young people, what can change, what can't, and what are the dangers and opportunities when we say to youth, we want you to lead everything? Those are my questions. Thank you. Be careful with this, Andres. Don't go backwards.
I'm not going to ask Katy how it works.
No.
So, am I going backwards?
No, you're going. That's right. Go ahead. They got the idea. There you go.
Okay. So it's actually only one big button.
Oh, great.
But
I was pressing that one.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right. And, okay. So good morning again. As I said before, I want to go a little further back. What happens before we actually address young people for participation and how we can build democratic culture and participatory structures at early ages. So what I'm going to talk about is just going to go through some some insight in how this actually works when we are working with schools, specifically in school venues. This is based partially on our own experience in Coglobal, but also we have been looking at what other people are doing, not only in Spain, but in other countries. And that is reflected in a chapter in this book here, Educating for Democracy, that I highly recommend, not because we're in it, but because it's a book that has, it gathers information of how participation is working in schools, many different countries in the world, and it's really interesting if you're into it, right? So when we're talking about, in this case, participation that has been promoted by local governments, but is carried out in school contexts, then we have a multi-level coordination that is necessary, where we need the local governments and the schools to agree on stuff, but also bring in, and that's kind of what we're talking about in this panel, bring in the kids, right? So we have been looking at, so how is this done in different places, and how do we do it ourselves? And kind of trying to find out which are the main components of the design. So kind of, let's say, which is the process behind the process that allows us to have a design to carry on. So there are three main components or more, but there are three main components I wanted to share with you, which are about co-design. So this is before we actually start. It's about selection, which is at the beginning of our process. So selection is about who's going to participate in the process. And it's about co-management, which is from before and until after the process. So the big question here that we have to look at is which is the role that each one of these levels of power have in the design process, in the management, in the selection, right? So I'm going to have just three cases from Spain I'm going to share with you that kind of can allow us to go through these components. So we have this case in Cartagena, which is a municipality in the southeast of the country, where they have found a way to involve school staff strongly in these participatory processes. In this case, it's participatory budgeting with kids. And so it's about that the city council organizes a competition every year that opens up to all schools in the municipality. And the schools have to submit a proposal with facilitation plans. So instead of having the municipality designing the whole process and then knocking on the school's doors and saying, hey, we want to do this, are you coming along? They actually invite the schools to design the process. They get some terms in which they have to, that they have to attend to, but they design them themselves. And many of these schools are actually co-designing these processes with the students. And so they're involving students, especially now that they've been doing it over several years. They involve students that were more active one year. They involve them in the design of the processes next year and the co-management. So this is good. It's a good practice. It works. What we see in most participatory budgeting carried out by municipalities in schools is that the school staff is relatively passive. They don't get a role. They're not invited to have a role. And many times they will see the process as time-consuming and distracting from the school curriculum. So having them on board is really interesting. And as you can see here, 60 schools they got on board last year, right? So we're not talking about small numbers. It's a really good practice. Now, the students themselves, they can be engaged. As I said, in the case of Cartagena, that is something that happens in some schools. I'm bringing up the case too of Peligros, which is a smaller city close to Granada, And in this case, they've also been working on participatory budgeting since 2013, so they're on 12 years now. And they started straight from the beginning, they knew that if they wanted this process to be a thing, like something that really could transform on a local level, they needed young people to get involved. And they started from the beginning, right? So they started in schools, in middle schools, and with kids ages 12 to 14 mainly. And so they started with an educational focus. They went to schools, explained what the program was about, made some games about it, and involved kids in analyzing their needs and priorities, and allowed them to create proposals. So these kids that took part in the first year then were invited to be part of the co-designing and co-management of the project in the following years, and have been growingly involved, and over time created youth organizations that have like a high level of autonomy in the actual management of this process. Several of these young people are now actually public elected officials, have become very involved in their own community. Some of them have created small businesses, cooperatives of facilitators, and are living out of that now. So, you know, there's a lot going on. And selection. So selection is key in participatory processes, right? We have all kinds of participatory budgeting going on in schools. So we have processes where the teachers will select, like the teaching staff will select which kids are gonna take part in the PB. Now, you have cases where the teachers will go with criteria like the proficiency of the kids in school, which is like kind of contradictory, let's say, taking into account that maybe those aren't the ones that need most support to be included in participation in a decision-making, right? But you also have some schools where the school staff get involved in finding like inclusion criteria to kind of involve kids that maybe have some sort of handicap, or maybe they are of some minority community that have more problems getting involved in school things, right? But there are also other ways of avoiding self-selection or selection. So avoiding that somebody is actually selecting who is going to take part. So basing on randomization, so we have this case of Falck, which is a municipality in Valencia, where they carry out PB in all 6th grade classrooms in the municipality every year, right? In such a way that all kids in the school at a certain point in their lives, when they are between 11 and 12, will take part in a participatory budget. So then again, it is to be said that here the facilitation is very important, because you can get to a classroom, carry out a full participatory process, and still not engage the kids that are more isolated, right? So you need an intersectional focus. You need to be aware of who is in the center and who is in the margins, and work on that, right? But still, it's a way to reach out to a full population of kids. In Puente Genil is another example, also in the south, where they randomly select 3 full classrooms every year. So they don't like reach out to all kids maybe, but they do have this randomized selection, which is very important for the inclusive focus. Yeah, so that was a bit what I wanted to share with you. And if you have any questions later on, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm talking about the New York participatory budgeting process, the older one that is that started in 2011. and is based on city council districts. In New York, there are 51 of them, and each one represents around 170,000 people. Each one, around half of the districts participate, so that adds up to 30 to 40 million for PB in this process. But the city budget is around 100 billion, so it's a very small percentage. And here on the left, you see a book. I'm just borrowing the book cover photograph. This book is partly about what happens when governments emphasize technical knowledge and what seems easy to plan from an aerial view, rather than what is pragmatic to get from point A to point B. And on the right, you see what is called a line of desire. In urban planning, these are unplanned trails made by foot traffic rather than marked by pavement. So maybe you can see lines of desire after snowfall in places where it snows, for instance. The Spanish poet Antonio Machado wrote, "Se hace camino al andar," or "you make the way by walking." In grass, it takes just 15 passages to create a new trail. So good urban planning attempts to accommodate such lines of desire. This is not always possible. Some might exacerbate erosion, for instance, but it makes a difference to see where people's needs are and where they might draw upon their own knowledge to create solutions. So here I want to talk about the participatory budgeting PB process in New York that I have been researching for over a decade, and how youth work to make what I call budget lines of desire. So at first, in 2011, youth in New York were not allowed to vote in PB, but they were allowed to participate in assemblies. And I just also want to point out that it's not a coincidence that it started at the same time as Occupy Wall Street in New York. And so that was the political moment, and this young person is referencing that with his t-shirt that says "We are the 99% handwritten on it." And through their participation in assemblies, the adults in the room then saw how youth were more than capable of forwarding solid project ideas. Youth were especially adept at drawing upon local knowledge that city planners might not know about. Like they would say, this specific block between 3rd Avenue and 2nd Avenue feels less safe in the after-school hours, for example. And they also easily analyzed intersectionalities, or how different forces like race and gender intersect in their lives. For instance, black boys in the assemblies would talk about how even if they didn't have an activity after school that day, they would wait 2 hours for female classmates to leave so that they could go to the subway stations together, so that they were less likely to get harassed by the police. So they used these experiences to better articulate projects that help everyone feel safe. And over time, because of their contributions in assemblies, the voting age went down from 18 to 16 to 14 to 11. Some districts have exceptions. You can be under the age of 11 if you participate in these ways, etc. And when we surveyed around 50,000 or so of the participants in the PB process, 1 in 4 respondents said that they were not eligible to vote in regular elections, mostly if they were youth or undocumented immigrants. So in terms of inclusion and who participates, it feels like it was a success. But after a decade or so, a lot of the residents have become disenchanted with the process because a lot of their ideas are deemed ineligible or just too expensive. One of the city agency representatives said to me, it feels like PB participants have a champagne taste with a beer pocketbook. And they live under such austerity or budget cuts that that they feel like they're using PB for basic needs, especially public school bathrooms. So here's a recent social media post I was not happy to see. It says, "Participatory budgeting is the worst. Every year, PB makes me die a little inside. We're pitting schools against playgrounds. It's awful." So in response, some youth in New York PB have been refusing to compete against each other for little crumbs of the budget. On the right is one example of a mock-up that won of 5 schools working together to pool their resources to propose reclaiming a public space. And school bathroom renovations especially have won a lot of PB funds over the years. So a final example I want to mention is that of infra-politics, sort of like infrared under-the-radar politics that sneak in what the youth feel like truly different projects into school bathrooms. Here on the right, we have a project, menstrual equity, forwarded by 12-year-olds who said they wanted to address menstrual equity issues and medical racism, and another project on the right to make a middle school bathroom an all-gender one. And they work to make the space safe, not just for students identifying as transgendered or non-binary, but also feeling bullied or with physical disabilities or just needing more personal space. And they purposefully kept their submissions to city agencies a little bit vague, mainly using the same language of school bathroom renovations that keep winning anyway, to just make it a little bit more likely to get approved. And they also plan to make the bathrooms, this bathroom all gender just through practice, just by starting to all use it, partly so that they didn't want anyone to feel self-conscious using it, and if necessary, to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. So I would say that while youth have appreciated being able to participate in New York PB, a lot also unfortunately lost trust in the process, and in response, the ones who remain excited are especially interested in projects that are like new budget lines of desire that act as example cases or initial deposits for bigger, truly different programs. So when I looked through ballot items for maybe examples, I saw a lot of words like pilot project, down payment, deposit, to try to introduce something different, and not just what government already wants to fund. So for instance, some recent projects have also included housing policy laboratories for them to learn about different sorts of communal ownership, like community land trusts. And I want to emphasize that processes like PB need to keep broadening eligibility rules to not just have a good design and stick with it. It really needs to be tweaked over time, and to consider PB's role in larger city budget and city politics. What happens when their project doesn't win or it gets rejected? How can PB remain a site of politicization so that they can do other things? And this is using a political anthropology, just Andrea Cornwall's framing of invited spaces like PB that are initiated by government, and invented spaces like mutual aid collectives that we saw a lot of during the pandemic. And thinking through how are these interacting? So some of the more recent PB projects that youth have gotten really excited about take some of the mutual aid projects that started during the pandemic in invented spaces and bring them into invited spaces. So especially when it's limited, how can it still be an entry point to something bigger? Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much. Let's hear a quick round of applause for our speakers. So we're going to have about 30 minutes here to open it up and have more of a conversation together. This is, after all, a conference on participatory democracy, and we want to bring that into the space. I'm just going to start us off with one question. And one thing I want to say first to you all that I really appreciate is I feel like you're speaking on multiple levels. And so both, what does it look like to create meaningful youth participation within a space? What do you have to cultivate? What sort of agency do you have to give young people to actually have leadership and to have fun? And then also, how do you embed that or institutionalize that, connect it to policy making, think about sort of the economy, and do you need to pay young people, and those sorts of questions. I also really appreciated you all talked a lot about exciting things, positive things, but didn't shy away from challenges. And so my first question is, thinking across these levels, where are you seeing some of the biggest challenges today in terms of creating meaningful, effective youth participation? And what are some of the ways you're thinking through that or opportunities you're seeing for us to move forward?
Okay, I'll just go quickly. I think and thinking about what we've been talking about at the whole conference too, that there's a lot of examples of youth PB here, which I think are really great because they have, obviously PB has that very exciting element of accountability, right? Whatever is voted on has to be spent and the budget is there already. I think beyond that, in a lot of the kind of youth assemblies, youth councils, youth advisory boards that we see, or in my experience too in the UK, there's not necessarily a lot of accountability embedded in. And there's this kind of advisory role, but not necessarily kind of, again, that giving up of real decision-making power to young people. And I would even say maybe in Celina's examples, like the kind of smallness of some of those PB opportunities relate to that, right? You can just decide, I mean, I used to also participate in New York City PB and have that same feeling even as an adult. You can just decide on something so small that actually you don't want my opinion, kind of, is sometimes how it feels. So I would say this is the challenge is how do we get institutions that make decisions, whether they're schools or governments, right, local authorities, whatever it is, to really be ceding that decision-making power from the first stance, and not only on budgets. Budgets are great, but there's also policies, right? What are the decisions? How are we hiring teachers? How are we designing schools? They're not only about budgets, they're also, and how do we make sure that we say, whatever you are saying in this process is actually going to happen, and there's going to be some consequences even for the decision-making authority if they don't follow through. I'm not sure how to solve that, but that is something that I hear coming up from all of us and that I see as a challenge.
Sorry, I was off. To build on what Katy was saying, I think there was one program, a bit like the one Katy described, that I was involved in the UK, which was a bit of a combination of participatory action research and participatory policy making, with two national government departments trying to rethink what the civic infrastructure is for young people. And so we had these great young people, we had a lot of different governance infrastructure, they talked to hundreds of other young people, they came up with these really, really intense proposals and new ways of doing analysis and all these great things, and then it resulted in a really dry, really long report to these government departments, which they issued, but no concrete policy outcomes ever emerged from. So I think also for those of us who work with or are the decision makers, the policy makers, the governments of the rim, to think about what are these outcomes, how can we make them feel real for young people in these bigger, kind of more policy level ways.
I would echo everything that's been said in terms of it needs to lead to tangible decisions. And I think one of the challenges that I see is longevity. So sometimes we partner, for instance, with the municipal government, and there's limits to participatory budgeting itself. Sometimes the young people realize, like, oh, it's not a money issue, it's actually a policy issue. And so I see the need to combine these participatory methods, but often what's available is like, oh no, we're just doing participatory budgeting. This is within the scope of where we can make change. So even when the city agency is all on board, which sometimes they're not, fully on board with enacting those decisions that the young people make, there's a limit to their scope. And so how can we change the culture around how we make decisions and really, truly commit to participatory democracy and not just think, in these buckets, these separate tools. I think they all need to work together. And the other piece about longevity is convincing government that this is a worthwhile effort to fund. So not just, like, why fund young people to lead, for example? They're always asking about numbers. Well, how many people participated? But the benefits extend beyond how many young people were a part of this program, right? The benefits are lifelong. And then when we talk about how we started this conference, right? The disempowerment that people feel, the disengagement, the rise of populism, I think this is a really great thing to fund, but how do we make that argument across our institutions?
I would say that that's where the challenges and opportunities are, in my mind, at least in studying the limits of New York City PB. The most interesting impacts have been spillover ones that are very hard to track. So if folks know how to track them better from the beginning, whether we call them butterfly effects or snowball ones or ripple effects, like for instance, they got enough the city got enough complaints about school bathrooms, so at least one of the years they doubled the school bathrooms budget from 70 to 140 million because of PB. That's bigger than the entire PB budget. Or students became indignant through and educated through PB and became more politically active outside of PB. It wasn't just because of PB, but certainly she said that it helped to train her to work on the Divest from Fossil Fuels campaign at Harvard, which involved billions of dollars. So PB should be designed not just like regarding how many folks participate in PB, but thinking about the whole ecosystem of participation and better strategizing regarding that. And I think that there are interesting things happening. For instance, students from New York, the public university, Columbia University, which is Manhattan's largest private landlord, and New York University have been working together to to push for new legislation that has already been introduced on pilots, which is an acronym that stands for Payments in Lieu of Taxes, because Columbia and NYU do not pay $350 million in taxes each year because they're nonprofits as landlords. And so they're forming a student union. One thing I've been jealous of over the past couple of days is hearing all these students talk about how they're part of a students' union. That's not part of our American landscape, but so they're using sites like PB as like sites of politicization to think about what are different spaces for us to even start these conversations.
I would say when it comes to participating with children, like the major challenge is to get a stronger focus on education, on democratic education. So I think over the last couple of decades, we've seen that kind of the memory of how we reached stronger democracies some way back in the mid-century has become lost. It has not been part of educational systems, and especially democracy as a practice has not been part of educational systems. And I think we've reached a point in our societies where we have to admit and be honest that we have not taken care of educating younger generations in democratic values. So that is definitely something we have to do, and that opposes to certain ways of looking at participation with children. So for example, this idea that any small number of kids under 14 represent all the children, right? Which is it's common space, right? So you have like a children's council, and how do you institute this children's council? Well, it's just like raising hands, right? Who wants to take part in this? But that doesn't mean that they represent all the rest of the children, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're involving all the children through these 10, 20, 30 kids. You're not involving all the children in your municipality in a democratic culture. So I think that's like a big challenge, to have like a paradigm shift and move on to something that is largely inclusive.
Thank you. I think we have a couple microphones in the room, and I'd like to open the questions up to the audience. I see you over here. I see another person here. And then also, I'd like to invite the speakers, if you have any questions as well, to chime in.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you. I have actually two questions, but they're tied to the same reflection. At the beginning of the panel, you talked about the relationship between adults and young people. And actually, I think it's very interesting to reflect about that, because if we think about it, most of young people are in relation to the adult world, either in family, in school, or maybe sports. And I guess that one of the challenges is that they struggle, and we struggle, to find other ways to be in relations with young people. I speak here on behalf of my experience as a Scout educator more than my work, but I think it comes in handy. So my first reflection is maybe what also we have as a responsibility is to form alliances between different areas of the adult world to be more inclusive. And so my direct question was for Katy. You said about struggles in having policymakers and taking youth seriously. So I was wondering if you do, or if you have the chance to do any preparation work with the policymakers before you have practices of legislative theater. If you had the chance to do that, how did it work? And I was curious about that. And the second question was actually raised by a reflection from the speaker of NCU. I'm sorry if I don't remember the name. Katy, I saw her twice, that's why. And it's, you talked about the fact that the youth had to change the wording of their proposal in order to make them accepted. And actually, I also see that sometimes youth tend to give the answers that they think we want to hear as adults. So I was wondering if you also encountered these issues. This is a question for all of you, and which ways you found to overcome this. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, let's be quick because we saw lots of hands. That's great. I would say yes. So usually there's a lot of preparation with the policy team. I think in this particular project that I was highlighting, that was sort of experimental in the idea of like, it's really going to be youth-led. So there was just less of all of that, because the youth were trying to manage all these different elements. So I think that was kind of the reflection on this, was that when everything is youth-led all at the same time, we're sort of abandoning youth to redefine all those relationships, as you say, that are really historically embedded in terms of power. And so, then even when that preparation happens, and there was that preparation in that project, if I prepare them, or a practitioner, or an adult, and then they listen to the young people, they didn't respond to the preparation. So that was the other thing, right? So I think you're right, like there's preparation for the process, but maybe I don't know yet how do we prepare other adults to take young people really seriously? That's another kind of preparation. How do we prepare other adults to reflect on their own power, not just for the process and what their role is going to be? That's a really good question. And I'm not sure. And then the other thing about, just quickly, about do we think that young people are giving the answers that adults want to hear? I think that one of the opportunities, which we don't always do in participatory processes, is that the young people need to frame the question. If they frame the question themselves, it's more likely that they will give an answer that they want to give. If we frame the question, I think it's more likely that they will give an answer that they think we want to give. Yeah.
I'll say that one of the lessons from this process was the need to include people that maybe the original organizers didn't think of as political actors, like the city agency representatives, in the process for writing the rules and doing everything from the beginning. And the ones that I spoke with who participated in the process themselves were much more likely to really take other participants' youth seriously. And so they were well-intentioned. They also feel like the school staff that Andrés spoke of, that they're already doing needs assessments, they're doing the best job they can, they're working with budget cuts. So some of this stuff is also harder because it's part of the larger political economy. We've actually seen some of the city agencies go to PB asking folks to talk about projects that would make up for budget shortfalls rather than listening to the participants' ideas. So one end is training the policymakers. And then the other thing is just that PB can be a really great school of democracy for learning to speak with authority. So like one person had been in jail briefly, got his GED, then participated in PB, and it was the first time that he worked on a multi-month-long project and had to do site visits to different schools and got spoken to with authority by authority figures that he was usually so scared of. So that was a transformative experience for him that motivated him to go to university, et cetera. So that speaks to larger issues in civic education, or just how what the regular curriculum should look like also.
If I can add to that, on the accountability piece, I think that's why I'm a fan of partnering with the government and going over those, what are those outcomes, what are the youth gonna do, what are the questions, facilitating the space, what are the questions that they have, can you spend some time with them and have a discussion and set some expectations, like what's gonna happen at the end. And it doesn't always happen, but that's, I think, why I'm a fan of having the youth programs as they come into the space so that they can have the dedicated time to talk to the city officials. And then for your other question, I find really interesting, because I've been surprised by the fact that, yeah, when young people don't frame the question, and that's often how I've arrived at the space, like we've already framed the question for them, they will give us, you know, like a presentation like the one we gave today. And so I think asking the right questions, unpacking, like, why do you think a presentation is what we should do? Questioning that logic, then you realize that, like, that's not what they want to do, that's not the question that they're interested in, and then we reframe the question with them. And also that's why I think giving them a budget to help them do what they actually want to do is really important, because then they have a little bit more control and power to really experiment with their ideas.
Yeah, and just one last thought quickly to your question. We've been talking a lot about how we do this in spaces that are youth only for the most part, or adults are there because they're policymakers, because they're facilitators, but young people are the main participants. But thinking about spaces like assemblies often where maybe you have, of a group of 50, like 3 young people, how do you bolster things there and make sure you're not getting the answers that they think you want to hear? And one thing I saw in an assembly process in Wales that I thought was interesting is they recorded young people talking to each other and played this is about nature, so about the future of nature, about their concerns, and played this as an evidence piece. And then I saw afterwards that this really bolstered the young people in the room, because they, even though they were the only ones there, they were like, oh, but I am actually part of this wider group, and here are their voices. So that's one technique.
Let's take some more questions, and maybe we'll take 2 or 3 together, and then we can respond to those as a group. I see one here, and there's somebody over here.
Hi, good morning. I work here in Valongo. Not exactly a question, but more a commentary. It's very, in a certain way, it's very interesting to understand that, once again, at your scale, we are all facing kind of the same problems. And it's kind of a global, and thank you very much for your inputs, because we will be able to use them very soon.
Thank you. I saw a hand here. Here, you can take my mic.
Thank you very much. Well, it's in fact a small story with 2 questions on the end. I worked in the Lisbon PB some years ago, here with another colleague of mine. And in 2018, when the PB was already 10 years old, we did an evaluation. And we discovered that youngsters didn't participate in the PB in Lisbon. So we did 2 actions, and this connects with Andrés has talked. We did the PB in schools, so we lowered the age from 18 to 16 and put them in high school, asking the youngsters. It was very interesting because they presented proposals that were more community-based, more with social issues, more than the adults. It was very interesting. And then we did also a PB, not just PB in schools, but school PB. So we did from the age from 10 to 15, a special PB for schools, like a pilot project. Similar to the Paris one, when they don't propose an idea, they have a selection of ideas previously they can vote on and discussed in the school. The question here, unfortunately, these processes are over because there was a change in a political shift and these projects are over. But in fact, these raised a lot of questions at the time, and two of them, and that's what I would like to ask you, is there a minimum age to participate in PB? Is there an age where you can start? What's that age? And do you think there are specific instruments of participation for youngsters depending on their age? So we discussed this a lot. We tried different methods. We were happy with the results. But one of the main things that you talk here is that you have to not just talk with the schools, but talk with the youngsters themselves. So I really like the Andrés scheme that you did. We are doing that without knowing. We did that like in a natural way, that we have to establish this connection, this ecosystem before starting, or it wouldn't work. We wouldn't ask not the schools, not the children what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do. But these are the two questions: minimum age of participation and what type of instruments. Thank you.
Any more questions? Maybe we can take one or two more and then answer together. Anyone else? No? Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's say, the answer would be there would be a first answer, that is, there is not a minimum age to participate. You can participate from very early ages. Follow-up would be participation has to be adapted to all ages, and that is not only a question of very young ages. Throughout life, participation has to be adapted to the people you're addressing, right? So it's not only a question of age, it's also a question of cultural background, community, gender expectations. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but that being said, from a more pragmatic point of view, I would say that participation related to political decisions, probably it starts at 10, I would say, 10 years old. Younger than 10 years old, it's more problematic to have kids connecting with abstract thoughts, and they don't enjoy it the same way. Whereas from 10 forward, age barriers, that is kind of flexible thing too, and it's also cultural, right? But I would say from 10 on, they have fun, they enjoy it, and especially from 11, and they relate to the final stage of the process, right? So they are at the beginning already thinking about the things that they can achieve, which is something that you don't get them that involved emotionally before 10 years old.
I wanted to add, and I know I'm coming from a US context, but something I think is really important, like you said, Andrés, having the facilitators be people that already work with young people, so whether you're working with children or youth. So in the US, what's worked really well is partnering with those organizations that are already serving youth, that have youth programs and can make it, cater it to them and their interests, and they already have that pre-existing relationship with them. So it doesn't always need to look like the government is doing it, and in fact, it doesn't always work out that well when the government is doing it if they're not working with these populations. And like Andrés said, that's for anyone, not just young people and youth and children.
All right. Another question I have is I actually work primarily with adult participatory spaces, and one of the challenges that you all were speaking to about young people is we need to make these spaces engaging and meaningful, and where they feel like they're really being listened to, they have a chance to set the questions and to have some sort of an impact. And adults often feel that way too, but I feel like sometimes we as adults lose touch with our creativity and get stuck in sort of more rigid thinking and habits. And so what can we as adults, both in designing and thinking about participatory governance for everybody, what can we learn from young people and how they approach things?
We were saying yesterday, I think like creativity and fun is really crucial for everyone, for inclusivity, for being welcoming, for being engaging, and also for helping young people and anyone get to new kinds of ideas, right? And so what can we learn from young people? I think it's like, how do we build, I sometimes do participatory processes where we build models out of trash, out of recycling, right? How do we build models of the city we want to see? We can build a model of, this is something you can do really quickly, you can build a model of what's the problem is in your neighborhood, and then rearrange the trash you use to build a model of how you want it to be, and then what are the 3 steps we need to get to from A to B, right? And that leads us to those policy ideas or to those budget recommendations or whatever that is, right? So kids are, like my kids are always building things out of whatever they see, Legos and, right? Those kinds of things that we can touch with our hands. And I also think that those kinds of either games or hands-on art, right, building, Legos, recycling, whatever it is, also create a kind of space where young people and adults can work together in a less power structured way, right? Otherwise, the adult is standing up, presenting something in the front of the room, as opposed to everyone working together. What if you had city council staff or local organizations sitting at tables with young people building models, right? And getting those ideas that way. Again, what are the tools that they're already using in school to think about, right? Telling stories, writing stories, like all those kinds of tools they're using to have fun and be creative can be used to generate policy ideas. And I think, all the PB experts here will be thinking about that, but that to me is, and again, those things don't just work for young people. In fact, I think, maybe to your question, the young people have that imagination activated, right? Thinking about the future, not really knowing what it should look like, not knowing what things are supposed to be, not understanding what tax is for and how who pays to fix the street and that kind of thing. And we can build on that not knowing, because that not knowing can help us create something new, right? And actually, how can we all learn from that?
If I can, yep. So one of the things that make me upset is when I see these photos of youth parliaments, and where you see like a bunch of young people under 18 all dressed up in, with their ties and their suits, and their hair will come back and so on, and kind of, emulating adults, trying to behave like adults in a way that adults themselves don't recognize as useful. There is this affection with democracy and democratic institutions, and then we go and try to have kids replicating what we don't believe in ourselves, right? So that's kind of nonsense. On the other side, I would say that with young people, you can rethink democracy in a way that you can't do with adults, because democracy is not a fully built idea yet for them. So democracy can be voting and having representatives, but democracy can be participating directly, or democracy can be analyzing with your community which are your needs. And actually, democracy can be in all of those combined in different ways. And young people, and especially kids, they are very open to rethink. Well, you have to take away the right? Because they're not, to think democracy in different ways. And I think that's a big contribution that they can leave for adults, a different democracy that we can feel better with.
If I can add to that, I think for me, that learning moment, seeing what they bring, is that curiosity. With that example that I shared about in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, the New York City process had stopped. And what I observed there is that the people leading that process are like, well, we're the community engagement experts, and we know our constituents, we can't reach them right now, and it'll create too many barriers to people that don't use technology, we just can't do it. And so you start with a place of like, my experience has shown you no at all of the time through your experience in the job. And what I find with young people is that they approach it with a question, and they unpack the questions, and then through following this trail of questions, it's like, well, how can we solve that? And so approaching a problem within that space of curiosity that isn't like, I already know, and it's a no, leads to really creative solutions that I don't think we as adults often let ourselves explore. We don't let ourselves imagine.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists here. Any final closing comments? We're good? Okay. We're all done. Please enjoy your coffee break. And if anyone wants to come up and introduce yourself and ask questions, we'll be up here. Thank you.